repeatedly that one of the most impactful solutions to the security challenges that and concerns that we face by implementing some of these transformational technologies, including the cloud and shared services, is access management and identity management. So we've gotten some thought leaders together on this issue. Walt Ocon was supposed to be here. He sends his regrets. He had a family emergency, and he knows that his panelists will take good care of him in his absence. I'm going to briefly go and do a quick introduction and hand it off to the moderator. To my immediate left is Mr. Greg Capella, who is Deputy Executive Director of the Enterprise System Development Office within DHS, the DHS OCIO. He came to DHS from commercial consulting, where he was the Chief Operating Officer for a small consulting firm in the field of information technology. To my right is Mr. Phil Wenger, who is the Deputy Policy Lead for the budget line of business at OMB. Phil served several roles at OMB and has spent the last several years developing partnerships and building a platform of technology services that is being used across the federal government. He is very passionate about sharing technology and expertise across federal agencies and is eager to recruit partners in his efforts to improve the effectiveness of federal IT professionals. And to my far left is Kimberly Little, the Director of Market Planning for Identity Management from LexisNexis. Kim is responsible for developing the strategy and guiding the solution roadmap for the identity management product portfolio at LexisNexis, identity proofing, biometrics, and other forms of consumer authentication. With nearly 20 years of experience leading global business strategy, product management, and technology business consulting, Kim's responsibilities have spanned collaboration on international standards, cross-industry best practices, and benchmarking to develop best-of-breed solution offerings. And Kim will be serving as moderator and content contributor for this session, so I hand it off to Kim.
So our panel was talking that we think you guys probably know more about ICAM than we probably do. So we hope it's going to be a very interactive session. We're going to leave lots of room for questions and answers. But ICAM, Identity, Credential, and Access Management, is one of the foundational aspects of pretty much everything that we've talked about the last few days while we've been here. When you get the ICAM aspects right, it's seamless, it works well, it's almost invisible. When you do it poorly, we are all in pain, right? We all have 3,000 user IDs and passwords. We can't get into systems that we want to get to. It becomes extremely cumbersome, and there is no interoperability. So what we hope is that we can share some concepts with you and talk about what's been going on in two different sides of a government agency approach. ICAM strategies definitely deal a lot with a lot of regulations, policies, and standards, and that happens more in the federal government space than anywhere else. I spend most of my day looking at how commercial agencies or commercial organizations and government agencies can deal with identity and access management needs, and it is the Wild West on the commercial side. And so what they typically do is they try to adopt things that exist in the federal side. So for example, I have read NIST 863 probably 863 times. And it's something that everybody who doesn't have any type of standard, they gravitate to, because even if you don't like it, there's very clear guidelines and things that you can look at and you can say, did I hit this or did I not? But all of that started with OMB 0404 that laid out the need to do risk assessments. They laid out the need to have levels of assurance. And that was, we're almost approaching a 10-year mark on that one. It came out in 2003. So if we look at the whole path of things, we started with, well, there were many things before that, but OMB 0404, that memorandum on e-authentication, gave us the first foundation. From there, in 2006, we had NIST Special Publication 863, and then just in December of last year, we had the update of 863-1 that added some new guidelines, kind of had a refresher, I guess, and added things like the ability to use text messaging to validate that you can contact someone. There's a bunch of other things like FIPS 201, and that helps us talk about PIV and PIV-I. There's FIPS, the Fair Information practices. I mean, so there's a number of guidelines that we all pay attention to when we're dealing with ICAM needs. So I think that we want to try to make sure that we talk about digital identities, access control, both logical and physical, some attribute governance discussions, as well as trust relationships. We kind of had a little precursor on the porch yesterday, and we talked a little bit about the fact that trust is the core of all of this, that without being able to trust outside your agency, let alone trust a Gmail account, how do we get to this whole new world that we're going to be engaging in? So I'm going to turn this over. First, I think we'll start to my right, and we'll talk a little bit about the perspectives of ICAM in your OMB world, and then we will move to my left after that.
Okay. All right. Okay. So I'm speaking as someone who needs identity management for my applications, and as someone who provides identity management as a service back to other agencies. So from that perspective, going back to our conversation yesterday about shared first, shared services, and on this morning, we made a decision. OMB, the budget office in OMB, is the policy lead for the budget line of business, which is an e-gov initiative. So we made a decision about 5 or 6 years ago that everything we built would be shared first. That is, it would be modular, it would be standards-based, and it would be built for outside consumption. So if I'm writing an application, and I really believe that no one outside OMB will use it, I'll still write it modular, standards-based, outside consumption, and then I'll set the permissions in the application to keep it restricted to OMB. Because in my world, it always changes. I'm going to be working with OMB, and then we're going to have some GSA folks who are partnering with us, and I can't get to them because I've built it in a way that I can't get to them. Because we had reach into all the agencies, because of the budget, we've been collecting the budget since 1979. So because we had reach into all the agencies, we used our Max ID as the basis for authentication for these systems. And so we had a couple thousand folks at that point. The park came along in the 2000s, and we went to about 4,000 users because we had deeper reach into the agencies for performance analysis. Through the budget line of business and shared services, we have about 60,000 federal employees and trusted partners that are registered with us now. And we take an approach, kind of a pragmatic approach to identity management, which is, let's think about how do I identify the person? How do I provision or identity proof the person? And of course, the HSPD 12 card is my safest way to do that. I also have the agency's email systems that I have some level of trust that the CIO will not grant email accounts to people that they haven't already provisioned in some way. Or I have sponsoring. I have somebody asks me to please add a trusted partner for their area. So I have different levels that I can provision a user. I have different levels of authentication. I can authenticate a user using user ID and password. I can authenticate a user using a PIV card. I can authenticate them using their agency's single sign-on, or maybe moving forward using text or some other ways. And so from an identity management perspective, I'm going to keep track of how well do I know who this person is, how well did I proof them, and how have they authenticated, and I'm going to provide that with a SAML assertion back to the application. So the application is going to make decisions about, is someone allowed to enter data into this application if they've only logged in with a user ID and password? Can they read but not edit? Those sorts of things are made at the application level. And then we're providing these services back to the agencies to say, hey, I can do this. I'm already doing it with your users. You can do it with your own applications if you want to, if you're reaching across agencies.
Okay, thank you. And Greg, how about on the DHS side?
Sure. DHS, as you all know, was formed about 8 years ago. And obviously, when you take 22 organizations and trying to combine them into one, it's a bit of a catharsis. When I first joined DHS about 3 years ago, we still hadn't implemented a single, if you will, ability to do authentication. So one of the first jobs of our office when we got stood up, which was about 3 years ago in October, we actually implemented authentication across the departments. Took about a year to get there, and we now are sharing 100 apps over that authentication service. So it kind of gives you a perspective that we are actually in the process of building. To that point, we actually are right now implementing HSPD 12 fully with logical access. So as much as we did come out with guidance, and PPD does report to us, it took time, it took money. And as you all know, when you get unfunded mandates, it's painful to implement. But we are implementing that. The Deputy Secretary is deeply engaged to make that happen as fast as possible. And we are actually thinking that it's going to be much less painful than we thought. Unfortunately, though, the original cost estimate for it was actually high eight figures to implement logical access. So when we actually took a look at that, we actually broke it apart, divvied out some of the cost of the components, and then kept some at the headquarters level, still in the low eight figure. We actually, as part of our authentication services, as we continue to grow and build toward true multi-factor authentication, we've actually implemented in authentication at the enterprise level, also SAML authentication, both internal and external. So one of the problems we faced about 2 years ago is when we tried to use services from the Army, actually for filling out a form that we all had to fill out at 15s or above on our finances. We couldn't use it because we couldn't authenticate it. We didn't have CAC cards. They didn't authorize, HSPD 12 cards, and we couldn't get in. So we actually are working now with the Army to actually have them accept our credentials via SAML, and that's going to be a big step for us. Just to put context around where else we're going, we have 12 services we stood up, enterprise cloud services. Of those, 3 of those are outward facing. One's identity proofing in the cloud. It's actually being used by a program called Self-Check. So your I-9 forms, the forms that allow you to authenticate that you can work in the U.S., you can now check before your employer does to make sure there's no misinformation in there that might cause you embarrassment when you go check with that employer. So you can actually go back in, you identify yourself into the website, you actually are answering questions much like you would with a credit card about your history, whether it's location or different debts you might have had, and authenticates who you are in a 2-factor. And then allows you to go forward to talk to CIS, and it'll actually pulse the Social Security Administration, make sure your card is effective for you. No one else has pirated it, for instance. And if there's an issue, it actually pop back a message saying, please contact this number at Social Security Administration or this number at CIS. So it's a customer-facing authentication service. And it was the first one we've stood up where we're using external factors to actually authenticate the general public. We're now looking at how we're going to address the presidential's mandate to address the approximately 1 million or so individuals in the United States who are not necessarily citizens, but are under 30 and over age 16 and won't be deported. So we're trying to figure out how do we authenticate those individuals, and we're working on that now. That's kind of general context on what we're doing and some of the products we're working on.
Thank you. So how many of you in the room deal with issuing credentials to external users as well as internal? So not many of you. And I think it is a very different world. It makes a lot of challenges. And one thing that we definitely need to make sure that everybody is kind of distinguishing is what's the difference between identity proofing and authentication. So if you're asked that question, I know that you're mainly internal centric, right? Mm-hmm. But what is the difference between identity proofing and authentication for you?
So for me, identity proofing is how well do I know who you are. So with federal employees, it's great because we got HSPD 12, we've done a background check, we got a face-to-face interview, we got a fingerprint, we got a picture. I know very, very well who you are. With trusted outside partners, then there's more of a challenge. How do I know who you are? I know you because somebody tells me who you are or something like that. And so identity proofing really from the lowest level is I assert I am somebody and I may or may not be. It's on my Gmail account, right? I claim I'm Phil Weiner and maybe I am, maybe I'm not. And the highest level, which is, I've really been through the whole, kind of the equivalent of the HSPD-12 or the PIV-I process, where someone has run some credit checks, seen me face to face, got my fingerprint, got my picture, those sorts of things. Authentication is now, I'm going to use that account and I'm going to try to get into some sort of system. I'm going to authenticate into some sort of system. And so at the authentication level, I'm looking at things like how well do I trust that this person's password has the right level of complexity, has been changed, hasn't been compromised. How well have I checked their PIV card? You know, is it a valid one? Have I checked the revocation list? Those sorts of things. So one's more focused on the person, the other's more focused on the connection.
Okay. And do you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. You did a great job.
And there's another whole side to this, which is the technical factors, right? I can authenticate with your HSPD-12 card. So I got highest level of authentication. I got highest level of identity proofing. But if my encryption and if those other things aren't properly configured, then I'm still going to be opening up my system to risks.
Right. So speaking of risk, do you see currently, or do you have plans to be able to use external IDs in your processes today?
So the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace lays out the administration's view on that, which is that we should, the private sector should really be working on a consolidated infrastructure, and I'll let you guys probably even know more about it than I.
Mm-hmm.
When we started using Max IDs in government, the federal CIO came and said, well, when they came out with this, the federal CIO came up and said, you guys will comply, right? And so the answer is, well, yeah, of course we'll comply. So from our view, I've got a list of trusted outside providers. I trust Gmail at a certain level. I trust other providers at a certain level. I don't currently have any government customers who are asking me to trust those folks. So we're using SAML, we're using Federation, the standards set up in the trusted strategy, and as those folks, as there's a business need for those, the technology is all in place, we just need to turn on the providers. For now, I handle trusted providers, or outside trusted partners, by letting the agency that trusts them validate them. So I'm still manually provisioning those folks.
So before I ask Greg that same question, in the room, how many of you all are familiar with NSTIC, the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace? Okay, so I would say that's about 15–20%. So April 15th last year, the White House signed into, President Obama signed into being our National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace. Is also referred to as NSTIC, N-S-T-I-C. You can go to NIST. Actually, hold on, let me tell you where you go. You can go to nist.gov/NSTIC to download actually the full memorandum, which is about 56 pages. The concept is at the core to have a public-private collaboration to be able to make everybody's lives easier to transact online. So it could be something as simple as me trying to check my banking account, or it could be me trying to apply for government benefits, or it could be a government employee trying to access something else inside the government. And so there, for the last year, there's been meetings about every other month where interested parties, vendors, government agencies, concerned citizens have been coming together to talk about what this means to make the internet safer, faster, more privacy enhancing, making life supposedly easier for everybody, probably harder for all of you in the room, but easier in the end. And the goal is to have this new identity ecosystem stood up and operational in some aspect by 2016. And even with a date that's that far out, it's still a pretty lofty goal. The plan is to have the governance structure for this established this year, hopefully in the next month or so. And then at the beginning of the year, they issued an opportunity to create some pilot projects. So the INSTIC organization was able to secure funding, about $10 million, to be able to have pilot projects. And they had about 186 pilot projects that were applied for. And they were a combination of state government and commercial, with federal government and commercial, state and federal working together. But about 186 proposals were submitted. That was down selected to 26 or 27. And ultimately, about 5 to 8 proposals will be funded. And they will be funded by the end of the summer. And they'll have up to 2 years to show progress on how concepts that are innovative in sharing information using credentials cross boundaries can work. So that's the basics behind INSTIC. And so when Phil brought that up, I wanted to make sure we all had the same foundational understanding of it. So now I'll shift to Greg and say, well, I assume that INSTIC has a big play possibly with DHS.
Exactly. We have a lot of outward-facing services, obviously, CIS, for instance. And one of the things we're doing is taking that identity proofing, and actually we're already have the funds for it, and we're going to make an account management equivalent, so that once you validate who you are, you can come back in and then go reuse that identity to actually go and double check on what happened with the Social Security Administration or where CIS is with my record. That's the idea, and actually we're talking about whether or not we make that a broader service for CIS or perhaps DHS. Basically, can I maintain your understanding of who you are so you can keep coming back to us, much in the idea of the INSTIC, and basically validate who you are over and over. Until we get the INSTIC and some type of standards out there, that's what our vision is. Now, we're obviously wanting to support that as fast as we can. The obvious constraint is no one wants your data compromised. No one wants a Social Security number out there, your status, your passport number, your biometrics. I mean, my heavens, I've got enough biometrics on me. I think my feet print are still registered with the DOD. But I was going through pilot training, by the way. Back before DNA, they actually footprinted you because the part that tends to be recoverable after an accident is your boots.
Wow.
That's a true story. So,
wow.
But no one wants all that data out there, your medical records. And so you have to think through, how do I make sure that people in other countries, or even the folks who are criminals and trying to exploit identities, don't get in and start using that data. And that's a huge concern for us.
Right, right. It's interesting when we put this into context. Right before our session, there was a great discussion from Dee Dee and Jonathan from the DOD, and they were talking about their efforts around federation. And someone asked in the audience, because they said, well, if you have .mil, you can use this. And they were like, well, what about .gov? And they were like, well, let's take that back. So just the challenges of being able to go from .mil to .gov is a challenge, right? And so imagine trying to have a world where everything's going to be interoperable once you establish that something's a certain level of trust. So it's not saying that, to Phil's point, that your Gmail account is going to have the same level of security and the same level of access as your current credentials that you use today, but that when you receive one, you have an understanding that this is going to allow me to do certain aspects, and then I can also be able to cross-compare the levels of assurance. Because even today, a driver's license, depending on the state that it's issued, people have different perspectives on how secure that is. How we do birth certificates, they're all different, in every jurisdiction. So the goal is to have some standards that allow us to be able to compare and share in a way that we all have a trusted ecosystem.
I would just say one thing on the NSTIC is pay attention to who signs these things. Some of them were signed by the OMB director or the NIST director or the federal CIO. This one's signed by the president, so that should tell us a little something about the level of commitment of the administration.
But just to put out there, as mentioned earlier, and I think you've heard on the military side, for instance, where they're trying to share credentials and having some issues, trying to share our emails. Same with the rest of the federal government. Within DHS, I can't walk to a CBP building and use my credentials, even though I have an HSPD 12. Won't work. In fact, they reissued the badge to me just so I can come through the door. So we're still working through the mechanics of that. So that's actually pretty ambitious. And some of the technology isn't as mature as it could be. I can't pass my credentials through our force from one to another without going to Kerberos, which happens in our environment. You just can't do pass-through authentication. That's a technology issue that isn't going to be resolved in the short term. So we have to think innovatively about how do we get from the point of I've got a trusted individual I know, and I want to have access to all these different services and all these different force and all these different authentication schemes. That's going to be a bit of a complex technical issue.
Yes. Okay, you have a question. Go ahead.
Yes. Your discussion focused using the metaphor of systems, having access to systems. In some agencies, we're trying to raise our eyes above that because our systems have become horribly complex and, in a sense, silly because we have systems that are really applications. So we try to describe things in services and data. We work with the web service. We have live environmental data. Most of our data, get it out as fast as we can to whoever wants it. But there's some data that now has restrictions that are sort of role-based. As an example, lightning data. We purchased that from a private organization, and our contract with them allows us to use it to incorporate in our models. We could hand it to you in DHS because you're another federal agency. We're paying a fee that basically covers the entire federal space.
Right.
But we can't put it to another customer such as AccuWeather or an arbitrary member of the public. So is there any of this effort that tries to tag data irrespective of the application so that when it goes to generalized dissemination system, it could say this data is allowed to go, particularly in the world of BYOD, where it becomes tough now to authenticate against the device, that this user is authenticated. We really don't care who he is, but he works for the DHS, and he's allowed to have access to this piece of data because he's a federal employee.
So in case you didn't hear the question, it's more around how does that whole ICAM process really relate back to the data and I would say rights and privileges associated with the data.
So the baby step toward that is actually we're going to SAML with them, which is, for those in the audience, that basically you can associate with an identity, if you will, different claims, it's called, or assertions. Basically, I might be a member of Secret Service, and I might be in the U.S. soil, or deployed in the U.S., so therefore I might have access to the President's agenda. On the other hand, I might be Secret Service and administrative and not have access to that agenda, because I don't have the need to know. That's a baby step because the harder part is actually tagging the data at the element level, right? And we have not gone down that path. That's something we desire, but hopefully it's coming. Any comments?
Yeah, there's some really cool stuff going out there, and I was looking around the room for Peter because it's happening in the labs. It's not happening on the at the application or line level or the CIO level even for the most part. But there's a growing understanding that this need to tie security to the data itself is really important, especially as it starts to get parsed and sent out to multiple devices. So I would say stay on top of that because it's not this year's technology, but it is something that we have on our radar. Identity management, of course, just gives you a tool. Once I know what security applies to my data, identity management gives me a tool to apply that.
Right, and we all want to go to that level. That's what big data is all about, right? Going to the data, using a service against that data, and you're right, I shouldn't use the word system, it should be services, because that's what we've stood up, is a number of services.
So that was the other part of the question, if you didn't hear that. It was around the use of the word systems versus services and applications, but I'm going to take it a step higher. When we start to deal with InStick, we're definitely dealing with authenticating to the cloud. So what are the challenges you see when you're authenticating to a cloud-based environment, when you have definitely less control than you feel that you might have? And so basically what happens when you extend outside your realm of control or your network?
It really comes down to a number of different factors that we see, at least right now, and I'm sure the environment's evolving. It's going to be difficult or different in a year from now. But obviously, you're going to be concerned about who else can get access to that data. Do you have the right permissions to see that data? Do I have rights, for instance, to my own investigation that they did on me when I got my clearances? Probably not. I shouldn't have access, even though it's about me. So it's providing the right information to the right person without bleed over to the people that shouldn't is going to be a very complex issue, especially in something like the where you can't really see and have a trusted connection from here to there, an encrypted connection, if you will, guaranteed encrypted to that person.
Yeah, so there's two sides of the cloud, and we talked about identity and authentication, and I said there's these other things, you know, the technical controls. When I start talking about the cloud, those other things become really critical. That is, what's my encryption level? How do I pass the assertion? Once I know for sure you are who you are, how do I pass it to somebody in the cloud? And then how do we get, you know, Google and Netscape, or, you know, how do we get the cloud providers to actually recognize those things? So there's a handshake you have to do, and you keep it standards based and require them to follow the standards. Don't make them integrate with your own individual thing, but require them to follow the standards. Keep it standards based, and I think we can navigate that. But it's the technical controls.
So I think this would be a good time for us to open this up to the audience and see what types of challenges, success stories, questions you might have around ICAM. And I know you're not a quiet group. I have been in here watching all the questions. Anybody?
Yes, I understand that some of the states that have tried to adopt identity cards have found a cost impediment, hard to prove the return on investment, and sometimes they pick lower capability identification techniques than are in your standards now. So is anybody working to build good models so that the CFOs can see the value of this rather than just the CISOs and CIOs?
So with the states that I've been working with, one thing that I'm seeing is that sometimes there's a lot of regulatory guidelines that don't even allow the cards to be able, any type of identity credential, to be used cross different agencies within the state. And so that becomes a cost impediment, because it's going to definitely be costly if you have a different credential that you use with Children and Family Services versus a different credential that you use for your healthcare needs and a different credential for all these things. So back to NSTIC, some of the pilots, I know the state of Texas, they tried to figure out how can they create a pilot project to allow them to work collaboratively across their different agencies, and that should drive some of their costs down. I think the state of Washington also has an NSTIC proposal as well. Anybody else know about states?
The NSTIC is very broad. It lays out an ecosystem where we minimize the number of user IDs, so that I now have 30, 40. Ideally, I'll be down to 2 or 3. I don't want one, right? I don't want to use my federal user ID to get into my bank. But I do want no more than 3 or 4. And the strategy lays that out, and it's voluntary for the consumer. It's kind of voluntary for the states. It's not voluntary for us. For the federal agencies, it's required. We will comply.
In certain roles, we also issue federal IDs, right? Hazardous materials, drivers, those type of things, and those do comply with HSPD 12.
Question in the back?
Do you have a breakout of both of the big components of the cost driver when you looked at that 8-figure number? And are any of them, you think, individually subject to being driven down by policy or technology or something? Can you break that up a bit?
Certainly. Well, first is that some of the hardware didn't support cards themselves. So we got a new keyboard, for instance, in the headquarters, which was a simple fix. Some things just don't fix easy. If your laptop might be 4 years old, doesn't have the slot for an HSPD 12, what's the workaround? And at the time, we were exploring options. So that was part of it. It also had to do with, we had to reissue our cards for an internal issue. As we went to Kerberos we recognized we had an issue with the cards, and that was a big expense. And then there were some other issues that creeped up in terms of our networking and making sure that we had reliable means of assuring that that card was still valid. Rather than long hauling back to Treasury to validate some of the certs, for instance, certificates on the card, we put it in servers in our data centers. Quite a bit of cost. Tom McCarty is actually the gentleman running that program. He has the detailed cost breakout.
Let's talk about HSP as well. In DHS, if you have a FEMA badge, you can't go to CBP, or CBP can't go to ICE. Are you guys trying to do something with that? Because it's really hard. Every time you get a contract with one of the agencies, you wait 6 weeks, because you've got already badges from 4 of the others. Plus, you know, you have a state badge, which is top secret clearance badge, and you can't go into a DHS agency for stuff.
Yes, I had a TS clearance, and it took me 4 months to clear it myself. So when I joined DHS, but to your point, what happens is the badges are the same. So just to be clear, it's the ability to use that badge in another area that's different. And so what happened was, if you get an HS, I may not be allowed into TSA, and I'm not today, because their means of authenticating is actually when they get physical access, it's with a separate card. So if they have a separate, because they grew up separately, right? In the last 3 years, we get a centralized system to share authentication. So to your point, we're looking at it now. The Chief Security Office has actually been on that point. They actually grandfathered in anybody who's got a clearance today so that they automatically get rolled quickly to a new badge for headquarters, access badge. It's the reciprocity that we're still working on. And it isn't in the CIO side of the house. It's actually on the physical security side, which is a separate group, CSO. And it's a legacy issue because some of our organizations are 200 plus years old. And some of them are 8 years old. And we're maturing. So in short, we're trying to get there. It's a waste of money in my mind. And it's irritating to me as a consumer because I try to bring people across from FEMA or whatever and bring in those contractors, and it's pretty bothersome. I brought in a Fed from Secret Service, and the service doesn't share fingerprints. Just will not. And so it took us about 5 months to bring them across.
So I find it kind of interesting that part of the discussion has shifted to cards, right? Because when we think of identity credentials, it doesn't necessarily need to be a card. Smart cards have definitely a place and have been very successful in their usage. But some of the things that are going on right now are more around mobile wallets and mobile identities. I constantly say my device is not my identity. I am not my device. I can leave my phone, I drop my phone, I share my phone. I am so paranoid now that if I have somebody at the airport who their phone is dead and they need to make a phone call, I have to think twice, how do I authenticate this person? How do I know that they're the right person before they have my phone? Because, my phone is my identity in some environments now. But, when we think about your credentials, it can be anything. I was just listening to a radio segment that was talking about how all the Home Depot stores have now rolled out the use for it to be able to use PayPal to be able to pay for your purchase. And so the example was, and I know it had to be a man, no offense, but they said, you run out of the house, you have to run to Home Depot. Now, I go to Home Depot a lot, so it's not that part as being the man. But he forgot any form of ID. Now, I have my purse with me at least. That's why I think it's a man. But he was able to run all the way to Home Depot, grab stuff from his honey-do list, I'm sure, and then realize he couldn't pay for it. So he was able to give his phone number, his PayPal password, and then to make his purchase without ever showing any physical ID, not a driver's license, not a credit card, or anything. So think about what that will mean to us in our world coming soon. Or the whole discussion around biometrics in place of a credential. And the one that's discussed about that one a lot is like 24-hour fitness and other gyms. Well, that's an example when you probably don't have any credentials. You don't have pockets when you work out. And some people in the room know I like to work out. Not. When you go to the gym, you don't want to have to try to hold on to your driver's license or something. So some gyms started deploying biometric, fingerprint biometrics specifically, to be able to go in, put your fingerprint down, and then go work out and leave. Of course, there's been some interesting concepts about that because they're like, I don't want to put my finger anywhere at the gym. That's disgusting because think about the sanitary side of it. But the plus side is that you don't have to try to keep it in your shoe or other places. And then, of course, the gym's benefits is that now I can't share my gym ID with my brother or my sister or whoever else it is. So just want to make sure that we keep the concept open as we keep talking about credentials. Questions, comments, anybody else?
And I want to encourage us to be appropriate with this stuff. That is, if I am authenticating an application that really is appropriate for level 1 or level 2, don't require PIV cards just because I want to look good. I want my CNA to look good. Set your levels at an appropriate level. Don't spend the taxpayers' money to push things to a higher level of security than is appropriate for the actual thing that you're doing.
That's right. We can't have a sledgehammer approach. And so I'm sure that Home Depot, for example, if you make a $5,000 purchase, they probably won't let you do that even if you had the funds in your PayPal account. But they probably have some dollar amount, as an example, that would say, okay, up to $250, I'm willing to go through this process without you ever showing any ID. So I agree. There definitely has to be a risk-based approach to proofing and to authentication. All right, so we're wrapping up. Any other questions, comments?
Well, I assume that's toward me. The short answer is they sort of did. There's OPM for the Fed side, and there's also DoD clearances are basically all the clearances are pretty much by the same organization. The issue we're facing in THS are actually a couple, three. One is that the entry on duty, it's called EOD, is basically now a surrogate, I think, in my mind, being used by the physical security side to set a different set of criteria. So even though I walk in with my TS, they want to do an EOD on me in addition to that. In my mind, that's, I'm not judging, just saying, is another set of criteria. Even though I may walk in and I literally have a TS SCI, I'm sorry, sensitive compartmented information, another level or lever access. They won't let me into a secret building because they say I have to have an EOD for that building or that organization. So with this, we're trying to work with the Chief Security Office to try to get our heads around why is it the EOD has to be different amongst all their organizations. And to your point, we all think it's not a good idea. It's just the bureaucratic inertia seems to be kind of holding us back. It takes a lot of effort to change people. And somehow, just because I do one organization, and I won't name it, so don't ask, but they actually do their own financial checks because they don't think the financial check by the OPM was good enough. And they claim it's going to be so much better. Now, I'd be willing to bet if we put money on it and did an investigation on the probability of someone coming through with a problem with the background because of financial with them versus the normal, I bet you the odds are that they're almost identical. But they insist on having it.
One last question.
But didn't Congress mandate years ago that use the same background clearance on individuals in the different agencies so we don't have to spend that extra money? Didn't Congress mandate it?
Absolutely, and they did, and it's done. So we all get clearances from the same place. The entry on duty is the difference. So think of it as another set of screening that goes on in parallel to and independent of the security.
So as we wrap up, I want to just give both Phil and Greg a chance to give any final thoughts around ICAM and maybe things that we should be thinking about or things that they're going to be thinking about when they go back to work next. So I'll start with you, Greg. Any final parting thoughts?
Absolutely. So we're implementing, if you will, the ability to do work anywhere, and it's called workplace as a service. And one of the things we're thinking through is, how do I make sure when someone comes in with their bring your own device or a mobile device, how to make sure that that two-factor is there? We're looking at a lot of different options, but the technology isn't as mature as it could be, and I'd love to see some more technology there. I heard rumors that there's going to be some ability to push certs onto SIM cards. I'd love to see that. That's the type of thing that it kind of keeps me awake at night, is how am I going to make sure that we don't get compromised because we don't have that. But other than that, you said you wouldn't tell about the Home Depot. At least I had my shorts on that day.
How about you, Phil?
Well, thanks to GTRA, you guys are great. I appreciate this a lot. The big thing and the theme that you've heard throughout your time here is you find the smart people and talk to them. You know, for me, authenticating folks out in the field, you know, non-feds is not one of my areas of expertise. So I'm going to talk to other people who know about that better than I do. There's a strong logical access Tiger team that's working on this Fed-to-Fed authentication, and we've been engaging with them because it's really important to us if we're going to authenticate feds, and especially if we're going to offer that back as a service to other agencies. It's really important to us to do that right. So find the smart people in whatever areas you're working with, and if you can use shared services with them, great. If you can learn from their expertise, that's great. But find the ways to collaborate with them.
So please join me in giving both Phil and Greg a hand. Thank you.
Thank you all, and Kimberly, thank you very much as well. It was a great panel. With that, we are going to break for lunch. If you go to my far left corner, lunch is set up there. Bring your plates back. And once everyone has their food, we're going to go ahead and get started with our keynote, which is Rethinking Mobile Infrastructure to Support Security, Productivity, and Efficiency. Thank you. All right. So basically, we'll let everyone, it'll take a good 15 minutes. Do you need them to, you want to stand at the podium or walk around?